So now I'm going to talk about a couple of finishing techniques for what you might do with something after you've painted it. One that I did to this one already is I sanded it with some 2000 grit sandpaper, a little wet sanding, a little dry sanding. And what that did is that kind of scuffed it up just a little bit, so there was some variance in the paint. Gives it a little more texture, and it even kind of sanded through the outer layer that I airbrushed on, and so it's probably hard to see, but there's a few little ridges here where the white layer underneath is showing through, so whatever you put as the base layer might actually show through a little bit. So that's one way to kind of weather something or give it a little bit more depth. I want to try another technique now, which is more traditional weathering. So what I've got here is actually some black airbrush paint. You could use regular paint. I've done this before where you just kind of water down any sort of standard acrylic paint. Black is pretty common, but so here I'm just going to put a little bit on the brush, and pretty standard weathering technique is you basically just kind of paint it on, you know, relatively quickly, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and then you're going to go through and wipe it off before it actually has time to dry. So let me set that down, and then let me wipe it off. And what you'll see happens is in the little divots you will get the black to remain. And I'm going to just water this down a little bit more. Airbrush paint's a little more watered down than regular acrylic paint because it needs to be able to be sprayed, and so that's how they basically do it, is they thin it out. And so you can thin it out with water or with whatever. So I'm just going to do a really quick over the whole thing again, and then hopefully before it dries too much, go through and wipe it off, which seems kind of like a waste, but when you see the results, what you'll see is a lot of that, and just a little bit of black has stayed behind, and so it adds texture. Over here on the tape, it sticks a little better, and so you can basically just kind of play around with that and weather whatever you've got. It's like you can't water it down too much, but maybe is quick on, quick off, and then you get some nice weathering patterns. I may have to go back and try to get some of this off, because I may have left it on there too long, which is hard to believe because it's only a few seconds. But so you can see, so that adds a little bit of depth, makes it a little dirtier, which for kind of a moon little piece like this, maybe that makes sense. So that's one way to do it. You can see kind of different variants of how well it worked. So there you go. So now that I've weathered it, I went back and I sanded it again with that, and that basically took off any of the weathering on the high spots, which is how things normally weather. And so all these little craters really filled in, really pop now, and so starting to look really good. So that's another technique, optional, but one thing to try. So here is the final product. You can see here, this is the original sanded version of the 3D print. You can see it's kind of, roughed up there just a little bit from the sanding process. But yeah, you can really see the gradients. Now, if I had only done the last step of airbrushing it, it would have looked like this. You can probably see a lot of those lines in there from all the different layers. If you paint it first with 3 layers of paint in this case, and then airbrush it, you can see it's definitely, smoother, pretty good, probably good for most things. If you sand it, if you sand it and then prime it with a few coats of filler primer, if you have a really smooth one, you probably don't need a filler primer, but filler primer, sand the filler primer, paint it, polish the paint, which I did that here too, and then airbrush it, you get a really nice finish, and you really can't even tell that this is a 3D print. It looks really good. And then, you know, weathered it, and a little red detail there just for fun. But you can see that the difference between just, you know, hey, I 3D printed something, or I put a bunch of time into finishing it up, and, you know, putting several coats on there. So you can really make something that looks 3D printed look, you know, much more finished, much more like it's not 3D printed. You know, different painting techniques can get you different things, but I think this is a really, really good example of kind of, you know, the different levels you can get from, you know, different amounts of work. So good luck.